Okay, it looks like we're live now. I'm here with, oh, I think we just lost Peter. I'm gonna try to get Peter back on. Oh, here he comes. Okay, that was fun. Peter's here with me now, and we're going to talk a little bit about how we review code at Cockroach Labs, and more about the tooling that we use to review code, which is Reviewable. And Peter is the founder of Reviewable, so he can give us some perspective there. In terms of introductions, my name's Adam Storm. I'm a director of engineering here at Cockroach Labs. I joined back in September. And since then, I've been pretty heavily into reviewing code, and we use Reviewable pretty extensively here at Cockroach Labs. The tool is super powerful, but there's a bit of a learning curve to it as well. And I'm still on that learning curve. So it was suggested to me by some colleagues that maybe we try to reach out and get some more detailed education on how to use Reviewable and the ins and outs, and that's what brought us to today. So with that, maybe I can turn it over to you, Peter, and you can introduce yourself and we can go from there.
Sure. So I'm Piotr Kaminski. I built Reviewable starting about 7 years ago. But before we get to that, I started at Google back in 2006 and was, accepted into their code review religion over there. When I left Google in 2012, I went to a small startup called Udacity. And part of my job there was to get sort of the engineering culture upgraded a little bit from the early anything goes startup days to something a little bit more resilient, reliable. We were on Mercurial at the time. We switched to GitHub shortly after I got there. And I very quickly realized that the tooling was really quite terrible compared to what Google had internally. So at Google, I started out using an internal tool called Mondrian, and then Critique came out shortly before I left. And you can find some write-ups of these tools out in the public domain by now. But then I was sort of stuck using the GitHub PR reviews at Udacity. I set up an instance of Reveiwable, which was sort of where Mondrian got its inspiration. And it worked well enough, but it didn't integrate with GitHub very well. And it required the developers to remember to do a lot of extra work to get the code review set up and updated, etc. And, well, I was sort of the back-end engineering boss, so I got to tell them to just do it. But it wasn't a very happy situation. And so after I left Udacity, I decided that maybe there was a niche there that I might be able to fill. And that's where I started Reviewable. So I see there's a question, was Reviewable inspired by Gerrit? Not directly. It's more that I think it all started with Reveiwable, which inspired Mondrian and Gerrit. Then Mondrian inspired Critique, and Critique is what pretty much inspired Reviewable. But they all trace their lineage back that way.
Okay. Yeah, I noticed that when poking around a little bit on your LinkedIn profile before we joined, that actually we went to the same university, University of Waterloo. And incidentally, we also landed our first jobs at the same company, IBM, which is kind of interesting. Can you tell us a little bit of...
That is not entirely correct. So my first full-time job was IBM, yes, though that's kind of accidental. So yes, I was at Waterloo. I was in a joint pure math and comp sci program. But I really consider that I started working during the co-op terms there, internships in the States. And my first company was OTI, Object Technology International, from Ottawa, which got me started on Smalltalk, of all things. And since then, I basically kept working in Smalltalk up until I went into grad school. So it was OTI, a small company in Montreal, and then a company called Footprint in Australia that was actually ran by Andre Boyson, who is in Toronto as well, now working on digital identity, I believe. And then Footprint got bought by IBM, and that's how I ended up working for IBM.
Interesting. Okay, and then I noticed that you mentioned that you went to Google. On your LinkedIn profile, it says that at Google you were an instructional engineer. Can you tell us a little bit about what an instructional engineer is?
Nobody really knows, to be honest. The way that happened is I was at the University of Victoria doing my grad studies. I finished my master's, never quite go through a PhD, decided to go off into industry instead. But I really enjoyed the teaching portion at UVic. I was a sessional instructor for a while. And so when joining Google, I realized there was an opportunity there to do some instruction as well. And so I joined their engineering education department, which is responsible for everything from onboarding new engineers through to sort of continuing education, documentation of the larger or more popular subsystems within the Google repository, all that kind of stuff. And so it has some instructional designers. There are instructional designers on the team, all kinds of people, but there are also engineers who are meant to understand the hands-on engineering that Googlers do, but also be able to describe it and teach it to other Googlers. So that is kind of what an instructional engineer is.
Okay, very good. And then I mentioned that we are big fans of Reviewable here. When I joined the company around 6 months ago, my first introduction to it was our CTO on a Slack channel saying, he wants to get everyone to use Reviewable because he's such a fan of the tool, which I think from Peter Mattis is pretty high praise. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about Reviewable, the company, how it came to be. You touched a little bit on how it came to be, but where it is now, some of the other success stories that you can talk about.
Sure. So the 2-minute recap of Reviewable's life so far. So it started shortly after I left Udacity. I got the idea, ran it by a few people that I trusted, and they seemed to think it maybe had legs. So, as every engineer does, instead of doing market research and figuring out the business case, I just started coding and got something up and running reasonably quickly within a few months. Then a friend very helpfully put it on Hacker News. It got, maybe like 7 upvotes or something, and it still crashed the site. So extremely helpful, really. Then, it sort of started growing from there. It got mentioned on a Japanese podcast, and for a while, half of my users were Japanese. And my university Japanese, I took about 3 years of Japanese at Waterloo, but it was not quite good enough to be able to help them out. But still, it picked up, so there was definitely a need to be addressed there. And then customers started asking to pay me money, which hadn't really occurred to me up to that point. But I figured if people want to give me money, I should probably take it. So threw together a quick integration of Stripe, and by March of 2014, I started taking in money. I think I got about $1,000 in recurring revenue that first month, and then it started going up. So that was very promising. It still took a while to pay the bills. Real estate in Silicon Valley is not cheap, but it definitely got there. And then the next big inflection point, this was all me working by myself so far. The next big inflection point was I started getting cold emails from customers who wanted a on-site enterprise version that they could host themselves. And initially my answer was, no way. I am not dealing with on-site installations. That is a pain to debug, a pain to run. Enterprises are just a pain to deal with. But eventually the numbers got high enough that I figured maybe it was worth a try. So I was speaking to one of them specifically, and we were making some progress. But then I told them Reviewable is tightly integrated with Firebase and the Firebase real-time database. And there's no way you're going to run that on site, right? That is Google's, well, it was Firebase's baby a time, but Google took it over. And they said, no, thanks. We're going to build our own. All right, fine. Nothing lost. I didn't really want to do enterprise anyway. A year later, same person comes back. We failed to build our own. Let's talk again. So we got together with their security team. They did a huge security review of everything. I fixed up some lower priority issues. And from there, it actually sort of took off. And at this point, the enterprise revenue stream is 1.5 to 2 times higher than the SaaS revenue stream. So that is really where the revenue is right now. So I've kept growing it. I never really took on employees until last year. I started hiring, tried out a few people. And at this point, I have 2 Lambda School graduates who are sort of learning and working at the same time. getting a hands-on education in software engineering.
That's
and
great.
it's working out pretty well so far. Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, so I think people are really here to see the tool and to see how we review code. So maybe we can get right into that. Before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about what I tried to cover in code reviews. And actually, let me throw up my screen now. You can see here that this is how we direct people to review code at Cockroach Labs. CockroachDB is an open source database, and so we have community contributors when they are reviewing code, and when we review code internally, we send them to this wiki page. I can talk a little bit about what I look for in code reviews, and maybe Peter, you can chime in with your thoughts as well. Obviously, the first thing we're looking for is correctness. We want to make sure that the code works the way it's supposed to work, based on the commit record, based on the PR record, that it does what it says it's supposed to do. But maybe more importantly than that, we're looking to make sure that the code is maintainable, that it's going to be understandable by other people who are reading it, that as we grow our company, and if open source contributors want to contribute to the code, that they'll be able to understand what our code is doing. On top of that, we want to make sure that the correctness is guaranteed by validation, so that there's sufficient test cases written for the code changes that are being written, and then of course that the code is understandable. So on top of it being maintainable, we also need to ensure that people who aren't trying to make changes but just are trying to understand our code base can read through the code and get a good sense for it. We talk about that a little bit here in the links here. There's some guides to reviewing code, which I'd recommend people take a peek at. But then at a high level, the other thing that I'm trying to keep in my mind when I'm reviewing code is being critically aware of the fact that this code was written by another human being on the other side of a keyboard, and that there's a tendency when you're reviewing code to, when you send your code out for review, to feel judged. And I don't think we want people to feel judged as part of the process. And what that means in practice is that instead of proclaiming things like this code is wrong, you might want to ask questions like, have you considered this case, or have you considered this other case? The other thing that I think is maybe a good segue for Peter, for you to talk about your stuff, is that we often leverage some of the features of Reviewable, like the fact that it has special encoding for nits, which allows it for you to make suggestions to a code review which aren't going to block its progress, and is really given to the user, to the original author, as advice as to whether or not they want to implement it. And we'll all show that when we start reviewing code. But on top of that, we're not really looking for typo level issues in code reviews, mostly because we have a great system of linters in place at Cockroach Labs, which check everything from the fact that errors are returned by functions, or errors are checked when they're returned from functions, right down to like spelling errors, which much to my dismay enforces American spelling and always trips me up when I add the extra U in the Canadian words. But with that, let me turn it over to you, Peter, and you can give us any additions that you look for when you're reviewing code.
So honestly, that tallies really closely with my approach as well. Obviously, the validation, testing, etc., that depends on what your company does, how you validate your code. But this idea that you discuss the overall design first before you dive into the details, absolutely, you got to do that. Have the linter catch as much as possible? Yes, not everything. So one of the things that I personally pay attention to in the code that cannot be linted automatically is naming. Is the naming clear of functions, of variables, of everything? And even more than that, because a lot of Reviewable's work is in JavaScript, is the naming unique? So sometimes you might have the right word, but that word is used in a different context somewhere else. And that makes just regex searches a lot less useful. So sometimes we will go and find a otherwise obscure word and impose a new meaning on it, just so that things are easier to search for. And that has really paid dividends for us as the code base has grown. Obviously, with TypeScript, that's not nearly as much of a concern. but we are still on old school JavaScript for a lot of the code base. Beyond that, let's see. Yes, absolutely. Assume good faith. Ask questions more than anything else. And very often, so when you ask a question, it's great because either you found a real problem and they can fix it, or it's a misunderstanding and they can fix it by adding comments to the code, renaming something perhaps, who knows, right? But either way, it's something to fix, most likely. And the knit stuff for style, yes, absolutely. And you can go actually even less picky than that. If you prefix FYI, then it is literally a completely non-blocking comment. Like they don't even have to click on anything. It doesn't count. They will still see it as a new comment, but it is considered resolved from the get-go. And so I sometimes use that to initiate, side discussions or things where it really is completely their choice whether to do anything about it or not, and they are free to just ignore it. But yeah, otherwise, I think you're right on target with how you guys are doing things.
Okay, great. So then let's start into the process. So I'm gonna go hit up the Reviewable website, and I was looking at this morning. I think it really resonated with me down here. This shut up and take my money part of when you were talking about taking money from people. So we're gonna dive right in because we're already using it. So I'm gonna sign in with my GitHub ID. Which is already cached.
That homepage has not been refreshed in, I think, over 5 or 6 years. It has been on the to-do list forever.
Yeah, well, I think it's great for not being updated. When you log in, it shows your user ID here and gives you this toolbar. I'm going to click here on the top on my reviews, which is going to take me to, this is a panel that I've actually never used before until this morning, but I was poking around a little bit. And the reason why I've never used it is because we have Reviewable integrated into our GitHub flow. So when a PR comes out for review, we get that big purple button that we click on and punches us out to the individual reviews. So I don't spend a lot of time in here, but for people who have a lot of reviews to manage, I could see this being very helpful. We're going to try to pick off these 2 reviews here in this session. I'm actually going to start with the second one. Now, this is a review.
A few words about that list of reviews?
Absolutely. Go nuts.
Sure. So one of the things that we added very recently was actually this organization picker up in the header. So you can very quickly constrain your list. Of course, your reviews are only from CockroachDB, but many people use it for both personal and company projects. And then, yeah, this table, this list is very good just for giving you an overview. And some customers, for example, have used it during their weekly stand-ups just to sort of see what is the status of running reviews, ask what's blocking, etc. And that query field is actually surprisingly powerful. There's a pretty extensive filtering language built into this, so you can build custom queries, save them, and apply them later. And it just lets you, if you have more than 3 open reviews like you, which unfortunately does happen, it can really help narrow this list down. And what else?
Maybe we can talk a little bit about what's going on over here on the right side, like these
Sure.
Icons.
So this is actually a recap of what you will see in the toolbar when you enter the review proper. It gives you, the first is the health status. So status checks, GitHub status checks, is the PR mergeable, stuff like that. If there's a check mark, everything's good. If there's a little clock, then something is pending. Then it shows you the number of files that are not reviewed at the moment, at the latest revision. And then the number of unresolved discussions, or in this case, discussions awaiting your response. If you've responded to everything, it will switch to showing unresolved ones. And then the final one is, do you have any drafts pending? So apparently on the second review, you have a draft that you haven't sent yet. So that is sometimes useful to know. And another nice thing is, when a PR is ready to merge, all of these disappear, and a button shows up right in the list to let you merge with PR from right here. You don't even have to open the review.
That's great. Okay, so let's dive into this review. You can see my screen okay? Like the font is big enough?
I'm good.
Okay. So this is a review that, to provide a bit of context of where we are in Cockroach Labs right now, we're actually in what's called our stability period, which means we're getting ready to release a new version of our release. And as a result, the influx of changes to our product has really slowed down to a bit of a trickle so that we can stabilize, ensure that we're doing all of the validation necessary so that we can ship a quality product. So it's maybe not the best time to run this session because we don't, like you say, I only have 2 reviews pending, which is very atypical. But I think it's good because we have some reviews that are on their 2nd or 3rd iteration. And personally, I find that that's where things get the trickiest in Reviewable to manage, not just Reviewable, but in general. There's been a lot of changes to the code and we need to figure out what's happened since the last revision and so on. So maybe we can walk through a little bit of how the UI looks when you're in a particular review. And what I'm interested in is, I mean, we've covered a bunch of this top part here in the overview or the dashboard. I'm not sure what you call that.
Usually the dashboard.
Okay, but what I'm interested in is talking about this section up here, the changes box. So maybe you can talk to me about what's going on there, what is going on each of these 3 sections.
So that changes box wasn't there for a pretty long time, actually. I put it in because people new to Reviewable were complaining that when they land on the review page, they just got dumped right into the review and they had no sort of overview of what was going on. So I decided to add this, and it turned out to be a pretty convenient spot to add a whole bunch of controls. So it's separated into 3 sections, files, revisions, and commits. You get a count of each. And sometimes you will see, for example, 5 files plus 2 obsolete. So it gives you counts of things that may not be necessarily visible in the rest of the review. Or like 4 revisions and 1 temporary or 1 tentative, which you will see if you're an author. And you have some buttons for sort of high-level things. So if you just want to mark all the files as reviewed, some people prefer to read through the whole review and then just mark the whole thing as reviewed with 1 click, as opposed to doing it file by file. You can do it here. You can quickly jump to the next diff that Reviewable thinks you should be looking at. So there's a whole lot of very complicated logic to figure out what are the diffs that you really want to be looking at. And at least for me, it's right most of the time. So right now, you're already looking at that. But if you were to manually mess up some diffs, there's a big button there that gets you back to the preferred view. And then finally, the commits just tells you, well, how many commits from which branch to which branch. You can edit the target branch. And this very important dropdown of review style. So when I started initially, I only had combined commits for review, was the only style available. Because that happens to be how I like to review code. Or rather, how I like to review code when there's no strong commit discipline on the team, which has been the case for all the teams I've been on, where people just commit sort of willy-nilly, and then eventually they tell you, OK, take a look. You don't really want to see the individual commits. You want to see what they've done up to this point, perhaps from the previous point where you snapshotted the state of a review. And so that's what combined commits for review means, where commits aren't very important and you just want to see major revisions where you start looking at the code. But it turns out that there are indeed more disciplined teams out there. And that actually started out with the Serval team from Mozilla that needed this feature, where each commit is meaningful. And you really want each one to be its own revision inside Reviewable. And so when you switch to that mode, Reviewable will do its very best to give each commit its own revision so you can diff between any commits at all.
Yeah. That's very interesting. And this, I'm going to be quite frank with you in this conversation. This, when I first started and didn't know Reviewable at all, this tripped me up a little bit. And I thought I was looking at all the code and it was reviewing each of the commits separately. And so there was at least 1 PR where I didn't review one of the commits and it just went in, which I went back and circled around on and fixed. But I think that this is important to know, especially for people who are here at Cockroach Labs, because we do have a very strong commit discipline here, and commits mean something. Each individual commit has to test itself so that when we do get bisect, we can bisect it in between any 2 commits. So For people here, anyone who's watching the stream who works at Cockroach Labs or who's working on CockroachDB, we tend, I mean, I guess people review differently. I tend to review each of the commits separately now that I understand the workflow here. I think it's up to people, individual people, how they choose to group this. But by default, it's going to end up on review each commit separately. Is that like a admin setting, or is that something?
That's a per repo setting that admins can change, yes. And
Okay,
I assume
so
that's for you guys. By the way, one very easy way to tell whether you've missed something or not, that toolbar, as long as there's anything red in it, you have work to do. So if you forgot a commit, so let's say you reviewed everything at one commit, the files to review number counter will turn gray, but the changes revision will turn red to tell you you have another revision that you haven't looked at yet.
Okay.
And if you click on that, it will offer to advance to the next revision, and the file counter will go red again, et cetera, et cetera. So it's, one of my professors basically called it gamified. You keep clicking stuff until all the red goes away.
Yeah, it's I feel very gamified when I'm in here. So I think you've accomplished that. One of the things that I just realized very recently from one of my colleagues, Rebecca Taft, is this file matrix button down here. And this is disabled by default on our repo. I'm not sure if you can enable it by default as well.
It's not per repo, but if you open it once as a user, it should open by default on any future reviews as well.
Yeah, I've noticed that. And I've closed it here like the previous time I opened it so that we can see opening it up for the first time. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about this file matrix, because to be honest, I still find it a bit confusing.
It is. And so first of all, what's confusing is where it's placed. It's placed there for awkward historical reasons. It really belongs somewhere more visible in a sidebar, somewhere we can refer to more easily. And we'll be working on that. But right now, this is where it is. And it has a lot of information in there. So first, it lists every file in the PR, except potentially obsolete files. And it does it in a sort of cascading directory structure to save space and make things more readable. And as you've noticed, if you mouse over stuff, you'll get the full directory readout if that's what you need. Then for each file, it will tell you on the left-hand side is what is its review status, that red eye icon thing. There are 4 possible ones. Full green means you have reviewed the file at its current diff, at its current right-hand side of the current diff. Gray with a green outline means that somebody else has reviewed it, or maybe you reviewed it at a later diff. But in any case, Reviewable doesn't think that you need to review it. It's probably OK. Gray with a red outline means it's not reviewed, but for whatever reason, Reviewable doesn't think that it's up to you to review it. And this can happen in multi-party reviews or for various other reasons. And then the state you have, the fully red button, means up to you to review this. You should review it and click the red button because we don't like red.
Right. Okay. Let's actually, okay, so that's a good start. And let me talk quickly about this red button that you're referring to. So if we go down and look at actually a file that we need to review, I'm assuming you mean this button here or this button up here. And when we click that and mark it as reviewed, then the eye will turn green. And then I'm assuming if we go up to this matrix back up here, it shows up as green here again. Now this file in particular is probably pretty safe for me to mark green because all we've done is remove the include of this Bazel file. But then I'm interested actually also in learning what's going on the right-hand side of this this file matrix.
Right, so that's where the matrix part really comes in. Skipping over the user avatar there for right now, what you have is basically a matrix of every revision in the review crossed with every file in the review. So at the top, you see R1, R2, R3, R4. Those are the 4 revisions. And for each one, at the intersection of each file and each revision, it tells you what is the state. So the background color will tell you whether the file changed, was added, or was removed. So right now, you only see the little yellowish tan color. That means the file was modified in that revision. If you see green, it means it was added. Red means it was removed. So it just gives you a very quick idea of what file was touched when.
Okay, and just to interrupt you for 1 second, just to be 100% clear, when we talk about revisions here, we're talking about git commits, right?
Well, maybe and maybe not. You are in your case because you're doing a commit by commit review. If you were in the combine commits mode, then each revision would actually combine potentially multiple commits.
Okay.
Right, and you would be able to get a list of those commits in that review discussion where it says for each revision what the commits are. Now, it will not do it retroactively. It tries to restructure the review, but because all your revisions are already snapshotted, it won't touch them, which actually goes to another very important thing. You guys clearly have a rebasing workflow, which is great. And one of the great features of Reviewable is that even after a commit has been rebased away and is essentially gone from the repo, or at least very hard to access, Reviewable will keep any snapshotted revisions and the commits that included them. And it actually goes and puts a ref in the Git repo itself to make sure that that commit doesn't get garbage collected, so that review can continue accessing it. And so that's what you see when you see those crossed out revisions. That means those revisions are no longer in the PR, but they are still here for historical comparison in the review.
Okay, interesting. Okay, and then I've seen other people do fancier things with this matrix, like move the slider around. Can you talk a little bit about how this is supposed to work?
Sure. So hey, at least you figure out how to move a slider around. Many people just keep clicking and never get it. So yeah, drag and drop, or just drag, I guess, is the right action to do there. So for each line, you see those purple brackets. They essentially tell you what is the diff that you're looking at. So for droptest.go, you're currently diffing R3 versus R1, where R1 will be on the left, R3 on the right, of course. Then in the next file down, partitionutils.go, you're diffing R3 against its base, whatever the PR is targeting. So that little inverted T symbol I used to mean base because I needed something small and short that fit everywhere. And so when you drag out between any two cells, you're basically saying, okay, rediff between these two things. And you can see there's a little overlay that appears to show you what the revisions actually are in case the matrix gets too tall to easily see the headers.
Okay.
And you can do it here, but here it's not terribly useful because you don't actually see the file. So what you would actually do here most often, you can also drag on the header itself and set a uniform diff for all the files in the matrix.
Ah, that's cool. Okay.
Right? And when would you... There's one more thing. There's one very special. So you have the revisions and the base, and that black eye shows the last revision that you personally marked as reviewed. If in the header you start dragging from the eye in the header, that will pick out the eye revision for each individual file as that bound.
Okay, interesting.
So if you want to say you want a diff from the last one reviewed against R4 for all the files, you drag from that I to R4, and that's the diff you will get in every file.
Wow, that's super cool. Okay, interesting. So in our case, we want to go, let me just turn this off.
If you want to go back to a default state, notice the next unreviewed diffs button above in the changes box is now active. That will go back to whatever diff state Reviewable thinks you should be looking at.
Ah, interesting. Okay, so that puts us back to here. Now, one of the things that I don't entirely understand is, in this case, it's showing us, or Reviewable thinks that we should look at it from the base, and in the other cases, it's showing that we should look at it from R1. Mm-hmm. Is there a reason for that?
Yes, there is, and it gets kind of tricky. So at the top of a file matrix, you see those weird curved lines connecting R1, R2 with R3, R4. So when Reviewable detects that you rebased, it tries its best to match up the rebased revisions with the ones they were rebased from. And this is just heuristic. It's essentially based on the commit messages. So as long as you don't mess them up too much, it should match up correctly. And in this case, it did. It said you had two revisions, in this case, two commits. And then you presumably updated them, force pushed, and basically caused the rebase. And it says, okay, well, that means R1 is matching up to R3 and R2 is matching up to R4. So when it starts to propose diffs, it will automatically propose to diff R3 versus R1 instead of R2, because that doesn't make sense, right? You rebased, you really want to see what the change was for that commit as you move it forward. But if R1 doesn't exist, it's going to pick the base instead. So partitionutils.go was not modified in R1, or probably wasn't even in the PR in R1. So R3 can only diff against base. If once you advance to the next stage, it will diff R4 against R2 because R2 was the file was there in at R2. So like I said, the logic is, I hate to go in and change that logic. It is extremely hard, but it works out most of the time, and it's quite useful, I think.
Okay, this is really cool to get like an insider view on what's going on in this matrix. I've also seen in the past that these squares can be colored in green or red. Is that for additions and deletions of files and commits?
Correct.
Okay.
Files, yeah.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so maybe we should get started with this review. One of the things that for complete noobs to Reviewable that's worth pointing out is if we start making some comments down here, let's say we just make a dummy comment over here. Well, actually, let me go up before I do that. I'm gonna get rid of that comment. This is usually grayed out. There might be some draft comment that I have. I can look actually at the comments, right? Oh, right. Do I have a, test comment, please ignore. So I throw this comment in before because I was fiddling around. If I get rid of this comment though, then we can see that what I was hoping would happen is that this would get grayed out because there's nothing.
It almost would, but you still have an implicit draft. So it's not a draft comment. And honestly, I'm not sure how best to show it, but you mark the file as reviewed. And that counts as a draft because it doesn't get published until you hit that publish button.
Okay, so if I
comments, but if you unmark the file, which currently is hidden because you have no changes or open comments. So if you click on the file or click on show all, it'll reveal it. Pick the diff, and you can undraft mark it. And now it goes back to gray.
Okay, that actually showed two things that I wanted to show. The first is that, and this was a bit of an eye-opener to me the first time I started using Reviewable, is you can, one of the huge advantages to using the tool is when you enter in a bunch of comments, you can push all of those comments at one time. And so you're gonna go through this review and enter in a bunch of comments in each of these files and then only hit publish either when you're done a logical portion of the review or when you wanna push all of your review comments. The second thing it showed, which is interesting and I always find a little bit confusing, is the algorithm behind when Reviewable hides files. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
So basically, if it only hides it if the diff isn't showing anything interesting or anything useful, and there are no open comments to show. So if there's any unresolved or unreplied comments in a file, Reviewable will always show it. So you're always guaranteed that all the comments will be showing. But if there are no comments and your diff is nil for whatever reason, it can be nil because you picked nil diff bounds, you're diffing a revision against itself like right now, or it can be nil because Reviewable's algorithm decided you don't need to see this diff right now or perhaps at all. So it can decide that, for example, if you already marked it as reviewed at the right revision bound that it thinks you should be reviewing right now, it's just going to take it out from the list because you don't need to look at it right now. If you change the diff bounds, etc., it will put it right back in.
Okay, great. Okay, let's actually, it would be a shame if we ended this how we review code session without reviewing any code. So let's dive into it. So just to give a bit of background, this is a PR that I'm looking at from one of my colleagues, Andrew Werner. You can see that I reviewed it a day ago and left this comment as well as some other comments, which now we're going to go through and address. In the third commit and fourth commit that Andrew put in on this PR, he added these comments. So one of the things that we always do at Cockroach Labs is we review the commit comments to make sure that they make sense, especially this part on the release notes, because this goes right in, well, it doesn't go directly into our documentation, but this is the breadcrumbs for our documentation team to key off of. So let's look a little bit at this commit record. So it says prior to this commit, well, I can read it and everyone else can read it in their heads. Like Andrew's style in writing his commit records, there was absolutely no reason to be using the low-level API. I like that passion. Okay, I actually think that this commit record is the same commit record as I looked at before. Now, 2 of these older commit comments have been hidden, so we can expose those here. And yeah, this is just an update of this same commit record. So he committed, again, using the same commit record. We do that pretty often around here. Like we'll do a commit -- amend, and then we'll get new files added to the same commit record. So this one looks good. And the second one, okay, so let me provide a little bit of context because there's a lot of Cockroach Lab specific terminology here that people might not be familiar with. So the problem that we're fixing here is that we got into a state where our garbage collecting job in the background, which runs to clean up old versions of indexes, was attempting to rewrite the zone configs. And zone configs are some metadata that we provide which instructs an index as to which geographical region it's to be placed in, because CockroachDB is a geographically replicated and distributed database. So the problem here was that we were attempting to rewrite the zone configs of a dropped index, which is occurring as part of a garbage collection job, which is a bit of a strange thing to do because this index is about to be dropped. And in this case, we were attempting to generate the zone spans, which we might not know how to populate. So then Andrew's just describing here that we fixed a bug that occurred in earlier 21.1 alphas, whereby when we tried to drop this index on that was partitioned by a user-defined type, then dropping the table could end up in this problem in the garbage collector and cause a crash. So let's, I think the commit records look good to me. Let's get down into the code. So here, this is one of the first things that I always look for in any code review, which is that you can see that we're modifying this file drop test.go. So there's some validation that's being added as part of this commit. And you can see that the big thing we want to look at is this part where Andrew's responding to one of my comments that I left before. So this was, as I mentioned before, one of these nit prefixed comments, which are going to be non-blocking. You can look down here, and this shows the state of any comment, either discussing, satisfied, blocking, which is going to, in theory, prevent the code from being merged, and then working. Can you talk a little bit about working, because I've never used it?
So working is mostly meant for the PR author. By default, if you raise an issue and the author replies, the discussion goes back into your court. It becomes read for you and you have to reply again. But often an author wants to reply with something, but keep the discussion, they're just saying, here's how I'm going to fix it, and I will tell you again when it's actually fixed. So then a good author will put themselves into working state, and that basically keeps ownership of that discussion on their side. So it will not ping you to respond to it.
Okay, very good. That's useful to know. Now, the other thing that I looked very briefly at this review before we got started. And so I can see here that I'm referring to a comment here. It says it's not clear here the fix to which you're referring to. Might be good to include a PR number. And if I look up, there's no comment here. But then if I look over here, this is this tab is sort of marked R2. Now, I think if I click on this R2, it's going to send me to the R2 version, which is what the comment was based on. Am I interpreting that correctly?
That is, actually, it's even stronger guarantee than that. So first of all, you notice that little corner tab showed red. It shows red when Reviewable realizes that the quality of the mapping is bad, that it tried to map the comment as best as it could to the correct location in this diff, but it's probably not great. And then if you click on it, it will literally go to the exact diff when the comment was left. So it will set both left and right bounds to exactly the state where the comment was posted.
Okay. Okay, that's great, because that resolved the diff, and you can see that the comment that I was referring to in this comment here is now in the right spot. So Andrew's response, I was saying that this last line was a little bit confusing to me. Wait for the index to be cleaned up, which would have crashed before the fix, and it's not clear what the fix is. So Andrew's response was, there's mixed feelings about this in the code base. I've heard it both ways. The main argument against such things is that it's GitHub clickbait and Git holds the history via blame, which I think is a fair comment. It's a fair response. It's also a nit anyway. So I'm going to mark this as resolved, and we can go from there. Now, this was not blocking anyway, but this is indication to Andrew that his response seems reasonable to me.
So incidentally, Adam, if you go back, put your status back to discussing, there's a slightly better way to do that. Notice the big button says resolve. This will do two things. It will both put you in a satisfied disposition, but also acknowledge the comment that you've read it. Otherwise, if you just change your disposition, Reviewable doesn't realize that you've actually read and seen the comment, and will keep it as new for you.
Okay, that's good. I'm learning stuff too. Great. So the second comment here was that this list isn't exactly ordered. And that was because the order in which we were doing things in this list didn't match what was going on down in the code. So let me see if that's been fixed. Because the order up here was that we drop the index, drop the table, drop the type. Set a short GCTTL on the index. Let's see if that's happening first. Yeah, so that was my comment down here. So it looks like this wasn't addressed yet because the GCTTL is being set at the bottom. So maybe I think Andrew, oh wait. Set a short GCTTL on the index. Maybe I misunderstood. I don't see where the GCTTL is being set on the index. Create. So there's the create type here, create table, create index. What I'm referring to on the GCTTL is this setting down here in the, oh, wait, I lost Peter. Ah, you're back.
I'm back.
Sorry. So what I was referring to is this comment down here where Andrew says he sets a short GCTTL on the index. Which I don't really see happening up here, but I could be missing it. So I'm going to respond to this comment and say, could be missing something, but I don't see where you're setting a short GCTTL on the index. Okay, so let's leave that comment. And is there, once I've made this comment, I can just leave it? Is there some way that I get it out of the way, or that this is just the prescribed flow?
You just leave it there. But note that you're reviewing R1 versus R2 right now.
Right, so it's going to show back up when I go to the next commit, maybe.
You might not have seen the change that he made to respond to that, right? You're still looking at the old revisions because you switched to see the comment in context.
Okay, and so when I move to the next commit, then I will see this comment will still be here, and then there could be some more changes, and then I could just delete this comment.
That's certainly one way to do it, yes.
Okay, okay, so let's leave it there. This was a comment from an old revision where I was asking, is this necessary? And he's saying, no, it's this part about setting the SQL safe updates. He's saying it's not necessary, it was removed, but I don't see it removed yet. So I'm going to hold off on that comment until we get to the revision that's going to show it removed, hopefully. Okay, this file has nothing here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to click on that. Oh, wait, I didn't. Okay, this file I haven't. How did this file get clicked as reviewed? Is it because I put a comment on it?
No, you must have clicked it at some point.
Oh, weird. Okay, maybe I just did that and didn't catch it. Okay, so now we're in the index garbage collection code. And I just left a nit comment here saying that we might make this slightly more readable if we define this as a function above the if branch, which looks like it hasn't been done yet in this revision. And also this comment about adding a void cache is not done yet. So let's mark these files as reviewed at this revision level and move to the next revision. I think that we should be there. So this is all green in the matrix, so that's good. And then we want to go to next unreviewed diffs to look at the next revision. Okay, great. Okay, and you can see here that all of these are grayed out in the matrix, which I think means that this is the only file we need to review at this revision. Is that right?
That's correct. Okay,
so we can click here and it's going to take us right down there. Awesome. Okay, so let's see what happened in this revision. Okay, so we have more of this red stuff. So I need to click on, oh, we lost Peter again. Peter is going to rejoin. And there he is. Okay. So we're seeing this again. Is this, I need to click on this tab again to get back to the revision that I want?
I mean, you can, but then you'll just be back to R1 versus R2, and you won't be able to mark R3 as reviewed.
Okay, so what do I need to do to review R3? Or maybe I'm doing it now.
You are reviewing R3 versus R1 right now, and there's basically no changes there, or there's no changes in this area. So chances are that the changes you're looking for will be in R4 in the next revision to review.
Okay. So then I just mark this reviewed and move on to R4?
Yeah.
Okay.
Which will automatically do for you.
Oh, so now we're on R4.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can always see in the header, right? It replicates that little portion of the file matrix, so you can very quickly tell what you're diffing.
Okay. So this is where things are going to get interesting. Okay, so I can see that Andrew actually caught something that I didn't catch, which is that some of his comments didn't have periods at the end of them. So that's great. And then this looks okay. I don't think that he changed anything around. Okay, set a short GCTTL on everything. Let's see if that's changed down here in the code. Aha. It hasn't. Okay, so this means that there's nothing in between these two lines, right? So I don't have to expand this to see anything that's changed. I did see that this has been changed. The SQL Safe updates has been removed, so we're good. We can resolve that comment. But I don't see any change to this. Let me expand this a little bit just to make sure. And yeah, it looks like there's not a short GCTTL set on everything down here unless I'm missing something. So I'm going to leave this comment here and mark this file reviewed. So partition utils has no changes in this diff, right? So I can mark this as reviewed. And then now we're on to the next, except that was the last revision. So we're done, right? And this tells us that we can choose either to approve or to not approve. I think that these comments are really just nits left. So I'm going to approve this.
So you should probably acknowledge his comments first. So notice that your comment counter is still 4. And if you click on it, it will take you to all these comments. And you should just click acknowledge and say, yeah, I've seen, you said done, it's all good. This is, I have nothing further to add. By default, it's going to keep a comment as new for you to read because it doesn't know when you actually read it.
That's a good point. I actually missed this because I don't know, somehow in the revisions, like I didn't catch that this was in green at some point, but it looks like this comment was addressed. Like he pulled this function outside of where it was defined before. So this is good. Okay, this, and so you're saying there's still more. There's this one. I don't see a reason not to. Okay, so I was asking if we should also add a flag here for avoid cached. And Andrew responded, I don't see a reason not to. We're in an async job, so latency really doesn't matter. If I were to revamp these flags, I'd make this the default. I may well do that, just do that later in the 21.2 cycle. I'm assuming he's referring to making this the default. Reasoning about an inconsistent view is fundamentally difficult and bug prone, which is why I always, when I'm writing this code, try to avoid the cache if necessary. What we're referring to here is the cache of our mutable table descriptors, which we maintain throughout the database. So Andrew's saying anything that isn't on the hot path shouldn't use least descriptors. But what's interesting is in these diffs, I don't see the avoid cached flag used. So I'm going to add just one more comment. Might be, oops, actually, I don't want this in here.
So a small tip, Adam, whenever you're not sure if you're missing something because you're reviewing partial diffs of commits, just quickly click on the base revision cell, the very first cell at the top. And that will give you the full diff of exactly what's going to get checked in.
Right. And so you can see
commit by commit, but this is guaranteed to show you exactly the changes that are going to go in.
That's a great tip. Okay, so now I can say Peter from Reviewable is guaranteeing me that I'm not missing anything. Looks like this avoid cached still isn't set was at the intention. Okay, so good. So that comment's addressed, and then let's go to the next one that I haven't. Okay, so I didn't touch on this comment before when we were looking at it, but this is Andrew just leaving a descriptive comment about a conversation we had a couple weeks ago about round trips elsewhere in our code. And this is just a comment to me about if you want to get annoyed about unnecessary round trips, this thing does another transaction under the covers. So I'm just going to acknowledge that I saw this because I'm assuming Andrew just left it for my benefit. And then I'm going to look at any other comments. Okay, and it's telling me that I haven't approved the new commits. Is that right? The new commit records up here?
Acknowledge that you read them basically, yeah.
Okay, and then one of the things that I really love about Reviewable is that it, like you say, it gamifies the whole process. So now this button has the LGTM. I think that's fine. I would just amend it with a couple more nits below. But other than that, LGTM. Okay. And now that we have this comment in here, then I'm going to send it off and approve it. Okay. So that's it for this review. And that pretty much takes us out of time anyway. I wanted to thank you, Peter, so much for walking us through this and educating us on Reviewable. It's a tool that the developers at Cockroach Labs use every single day. So it's important that we get it right. And I think that this has been very helpful, not only for me, but hopefully for the people who are watching the stream. So I know it's kind of late where you are in the world, so thank you for joining us. And I'm sure there are many other people around who at the company who are thanking you as well from where they're sitting.
My pleasure. And we're a small team, but we're very responsive. So if anybody at Cockroach Labs or anywhere has any questions, drop by the chat, drop us an email, heck, even tweet at us. We usually respond pretty quickly as long as we're in a similar time zone, and we're very happy to help out.
Great. And when you say the chat, like I actually just noticed this morning. Is this what you're referring to? The chat room here?
So yeah, so we run it on Gitter right now, and any kind of casual questions, is this even a bug, or even bug reports get resolved here. So just last night, I was working with Alexei to resolve an issue with when the done button shows up or doesn't show up when the author thinks they're finished with fixing something, but a reviewer doesn't. And so we discussed it, we figured it out, and I pushed a fix right away.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again. And I'm going to end the stream now. Thanks, everyone, for watching, and be well. See ya.